A happy life must be, to a great extent, a quiet life, for it is only in an atmosphere of quiet that true joy can live. I'm James Bergman, also known as Ahead of the Curve, and in today's book review, I will be discussing Bertrand Russell's 1930, The Conquest of Happiness. Bertrand Russell was a philosopher, logician, and a mathematician. He wrote many different books, such as, most famously, The History of Western Philosophy and The Problems of Philosophy, which is a sort of a short essay on philosophy, which is really, really enjoyable, very dense. I've reviewed it on this channel, so if you're interested in checking that one out, then go check out the video. And he's also written one of his most famous works, as well as The History of Western Philosophy, is Why I Am Not a Christian. And that is a interesting piece as well. Very articulate, very well written. He doesn't tend to strawman very much. Bertrand Russell overall just seems to be a pretty cool guy. He was definitely a polymath in many different ways. He offered information on marriage, although I believe he wasn't too successful in his marriages, but hey, who is, I guess. He wrote books on many, many different subjects, and one of them is this piece. It's got quite a front cover. I'm kind of confused at why bananas are on there. I'm not really sure what they were thinking. I mean, I quite like I guess it looks quite cool, but at the same time, I'm just wondering, why bananas? The premise of this book is essentially that it is a recipe for good living. It predates self-help books by decades, as said on the blurb, because now we're all about self-help books and, change your life in 7 days, which I've read. It was interesting, but my life didn't change in 7 days. What the blurb essentially says, as well as this, is Russell didn't believe in feel-good platitudes, positivity, and changing your life in 7 days. For him, happiness, rather than a basic human right unfairly denied us by whomever or whatever we are told to blame, could only be achieved through both personal thought and effort. But for those willing to make that effort while being effortlessly entertained along the way, this classic work could well be the answer to one of life's biggest questions. I was kind of skeptical of this. I was like, Bertrand Russell, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would write a self-help book. Thankfully, this doesn't read like a self-help book necessarily. It reads more like a philosophy and psychology book at times. And it's surprising because it feels ahead of its time in the regard that Russell was very aware of how the times were changing and how perceptions were changing. And obviously he wrote the book, The History of Western Philosophy, so he's very, very acquainted with thinkers of the past and the Bible, and he was kind of intertwining all of these things as he was writing. And it did surprise me, actually, this book. It really did surprise me because I wasn't really sure what I was getting into, but then I realized how articulate and how many great examples he has and how insightful he is, surprisingly, about things that even today's self-help books don't really address, such as politics, let's say. They kind of steer away from that, and they're just like, yeah, it's all about this energy, it's all the power of now, which I try to read, and I just couldn't get past the first few pages. I mean, it really, really rubbed me the wrong way. But at least with this piece, it feels ingenuous in the sense that even in the introduction, he says, look, I'm just saying what I think would be useful, and I'm not preaching this divine claim, this truth that I think it will apply to everybody, but where it will apply, he said, try it out and see what happens. With all this introductory information aside, I want to get straight into some of the interesting ideas and quotes that appeal to me, at least, in the piece. So yeah, let's get into it. So one of the things that Russell talks about is how man loves his suffering. He identifies with his suffering, and then he quotes the Bible quote, which is, "With much sorrow comes much wisdom." and with much wisdom comes much sorrow. With knowledge there comes the sacrifice of it potentially disappointing you, whereas I guess on the other side of that, through sorrow, unhappiness, etc., suffering, provided we construct upon our experience, we then learn from that sorrow. I think one of my favourite quotes in the book is the following: "A man may feel so completely thwarted that he seeks no form of satisfaction, but only distraction and oblivion. He then becomes a devotee of pleasure. That is to say, he seeks to make life bearable by becoming less alive. Drunkenness, for example, is temporary suicide. The happiness that it brings is merely negative, a momentary cessation of unhappiness." Drunkenness is temporary suicide. I love that. Russell is a wordsmith. He really does word his points excellently. Yes, it's not a wholly original piece. Marcus Aurelius wrote a self-help book, Meditations, his own diary, 2,000 years before. Russell's aware of that. He doesn't claim to have this special knowledge like many other self-help authors do. I think it's with this preface that when you read the rest of the book, you're like, okay, I might have heard of that before, but that was a really interesting way of saying it. So at the very least, if you are not new to some of the things that he says, you could at least be inspired by the way that he writes what he says down on the page. One of the other interesting subjects Russell discusses throughout the piece is the idea of boredom, and how people are becoming and are afraid of boredom. Why? Well, he says that people are afraid of boredom because it exposes the fact that there are things going on in the background that they don't want to know are in the background. In other words, people are trying to subdue their insecurities and their anxieties, and by inflating ourselves with this, I don't know, in most ways expedient purpose, they are essentially avoiding the issues that they might need to face. And though, of course, they are not facing it in the now, they will eventually have to face it. And because the longer that you wait, the bulge in the carpet, so to speak, gets larger and larger until you have to face it. And often when you are forced to face something, it is at the point where you are most unprepared because you've been trying to avoid it all of this time. So what Russell is saying is that we need to be more acquainted with boredom. We need to be more acquainted with ourselves. Like, try and sit down for like half an hour, just with your thoughts in your own head, and to try and reconcile your own mind with yourself. Go for a walk for an hour. Try and emancipate yourself from the busyness of life that is of the modern day. And we have to remember as well, again, Bertrand Russell was ahead of his time here, because 1930, there wasn't social media. I mean, there wasn't the same sort of resources that were available at the time. So it's not like he was referencing these things and he knew ahead of time. He didn't. And in some ways, some of what's in this book is a prophecy, because he's kind of predicting what people are infatuated with at the moment, which is distraction. Hand waving away of responsibilities and replacing them with expediency. With the next quote that I'm going to show you as well, this will be fully fleshed out. The special kind of boredom from which modern urban populations suffer is intimately bound up with their separation from life of earth. It makes life hot and dusty and thirsty, like a pilgrimage in the desert. Among those who are rich enough to choose their way of life, the particular brand of unendurable boredom from which they suffer is due, paradoxical as this may seem, to their fear of boredom. In flying from the fluctuating kind of boredom, they fall a prey to the other far worse kind. A happy life must be, to a great extent, a quiet life, for it is only in an atmosphere of quiet that true joy can live. Following on from the last line here, which I said in the intro of this video, a happy life must be to a great extent a quiet life, for it is only in an atmosphere of quiet that true joy can live. I think this is very true. I mean, look, of course, quiet life is very unavoidable these days, and fair enough to that, like, that's understandable. We can still try and seek a quiet life, whether that be, a walk Because Nietzsche, for example, went on 8-hour walks to collect his thoughts, to try and contemplate his work and what he's doing. And, you know, I'm the first person to admit that, you know, whilst I like quiet atmospheres a lot of the time, I don't particularly endeavour outside to do those things, because obviously there is a lot more noise now than there ever has been, and it might not seem like it, but that's only because our ears have actually adapted to these loud noises, and who knows what kind of irreversible damage that would cause. And I'm going to do a bit of a plug. If you're interested in the philosophy of sound, go check out me and Nick De Niro's discussion on my channel. It's called Phenomenology of Psychoacoustics and Sound. That was a really interesting discussion. But if that happens to be something that you're interested in, then yeah, check that out. I think you might like it. Anyway, without sidetracking again, I have a habit of doing that these days. Yeah, basically Russell believes in the quiet life and how it constructs a successful ethos for living and thinking and really being at peace with oneself. And I think this heavily relates to Eastern philosophy, which Bertrand Russell, I'm sure, was a fan of in some regard, of at least its utility in its connection with nature, as the quote itself says. Russell also believed that the rising occurrence of competition, whether that be financial or not, although mostly financial, he believed that the rise of this kind of competition was actually quite toxic for us. Because right now, in the modern world, people thrive for money and that's their motivation for what they do a lot of the time. Before, he claims that people were more interested in artistic pursuits rather than pursuits that were necessarily involving finances, involving money. And he would say that, you know, provided you had the choice, which obviously he would make that distinction, people were far more open to their artistic side, that they would try and indulge more with that. And look, I guess you could go both ways and say, in a way, people are more, they're channeling, people are now channeling more their creativity because there's social media, there's online, the internet and all that kind of thing. And I don't know, I think maybe you could make a case for both sides of the argument here, but I think that it's true, basically, from what he's saying, that people are very centered on their competition with others instead of their own personal journey being the priority. We should maybe focus on self-actualizing ourselves rather than just trying to impress other people. So Russell would say that we are now pursuing something for the money that we'd receive rather than pursuing it for its own sake. I'm going to read the full quotation, a certain section of this kind of idea that I want to read out to you guys. Competition, considered as the main thing in life, is too grim, too tenacious, too much a matter of taut muscles and intent to will, to make a possible basis of life for more than 1 or 2 generations at most. After that length of time, it must produce nervous fatigue, various phenomena of escape, a pursuit of pleasures as tense and as difficult as work, since relaxing has become impossible, and in the end a disappearance of the stock through sterility. It is not only work that is poisoned by much the philosophy of competition, leisure is poisoned just as well. The kind of leisure which is quiet and restoring to the nerves comes to be felt boring. There is bound to be a continual acceleration of which the natural termination would be drugs and collapse. The cure for this lies in admitting the part of sane and quiet enjoyment in a balanced ideal of life. And again, I feel like with all this discussion on drugs, boredom is this kind of curse, and I guess this mixed up, balanced ideal of life. Like, so many of these words, so many of these phrases in what I just read out is so relevant to today, and that's why this book does shine sometimes, because it really is, as I said, a fairly good prophecy. But I think Russell sums up happiness and unhappiness in a perfectly articulate contrast in the following quote. All unhappiness depends upon some kind of disintegration or lack of integration. There is disintegration within the self through lack of coordination between the conscious and the unconscious mind. There is lack of integration between the self and society, where the two are not knit together by the force of objective interests and affections. The happy man is the man who does not suffer from either of these failures of unity, whose personality is neither divided against itself nor pitted against the world. Such a man feels himself a citizen of the universe, enjoying freely the spectacle that it offers and the joys that it affords, untroubled by the thought of death because he feels himself not really separate from those who will come after him. It is in such profound instinctive union with the stream of life that the greatest joy can be found. In conclusion to this book, I really enjoyed it. I was very pleasantly surprised with the piece. It's a perfect mix between self-help, if I want to call it that, and philosophy and psychology, and it also mixes in literature and politics slightly, and he really is quite understanding of different people's economic status when he's making these points. He does make a lot of caveats, and he is a very fair and a comprehensive writer. And so, would I recommend this piece? Yeah, I mean, if you want a sophisticated, philosophical, ingenuous self-help book, then I would probably recommend this. I think it's a solid book. It's not too long. It's 170 pages in my rotilage copy, with a banana on the front of it for some odd reason. Yeah, it's a fairly light read, and it's very educational. Lots of great quotes. I think it's fairly practical, actually. He really was a polymath. I will have to admit that. So thank you for checking out this review. I hope you enjoyed the sort of things that I've shared with you today from this piece. There was a lot more quotes, but some of them were quite long, and I didn't want to add all of them, and I just wanted to keep the video to be as concise as possible. So if you have any thoughts on the quotes that I shared, or any of the ideas, if you want to build upon them or critique them, so I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers, guys. I'll see you soon. He's also written Problems of Philosophy, which is a very short piece, which is actually quite dense, but really interesting. Nearly dropped my book.